Sorry, now it's okay. I'm
Okay.
gonna make you a host. Make you. Okay. Sorry, we can start now.
Okay, sure. All right, thank you. So let's start with some mindfulness of the breath. And then visualize in the space in front of you your lama or your lamas, taking on the aspect of Buddha Shakyamuni. It's a manifestation of all the enlightened qualities we ourselves have the potential to attain. His body made of radiant, pure light, wearing the robes of a fully ordained monk. And then think that you're surrounded by all sentient beings. Reminding us why we're here. With those beings we have a hard time with, we usually try to avoid. Right in front of us. And then let's remember that no matter our differences, our different faults, different interests, and so forth, the one thing we all have in common is that we all want to be free from unwanted experiences, from suffering, and instead want to be satisfied. And that everyone has the right to be free from suffering and be happy and content. And so based on that understanding, generate a sincere sense of closeness and care in the form of affectionate love for all sentient beings, including those right in front of us. which then gives way to great compassion, the heartfelt aspiration, not only for all sentient beings to be free from suffering and its causes, but also the wish to personally protect all sentient beings from their suffering and its causes. And that aspiration then grows stronger and turns into the altruistic attitude that is determined to do whatever we can to assist sentient beings, to help sentient beings to overcome all that is in the nature of dukkha or suffering and its causes. And then that mind gives way to the mind of enlightenment, the aspiration to become fully enlightened for the benefit of each and every sentient being, based on our care, compassion, and altruistic attitude towards them. And it's also with this mind serving as the motivation for us to continue to study the fundamental wisdom. So then let's recite the prayer. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Okay. All right, let's start with the Lamrim outlines. Well, last time we spoke about this outline, the disadvantages of the afflictions, which, well, in the Lamrim text is explained really extensively, very extensively. Well, obviously, because as some of my teachers would say, Buddhist practice is actually just about dealing with the afflictions. And so becoming aware of their disadvantages, the way I described it last time, how exhausting they are, and how in the end, when we die, well, the stronger our afflictions, of course, the more difficult our death, and the harder is what comes afterwards. Anyway, as we're all aware, of course, the problem with the afflictions is not just their disadvantages, the way described before about feeling unhappy when they arise, losing our peace of mind, and so forth. But of course, most importantly, they give rise to karma. That is, they're responsible for the accumulation of karma, of actions. So that is again explained in the Lamrim. 2 types of karma are described here. So the first, described as karma accumulated through mental actions, or as it's sometimes called, karma of intention. And the second is karma accumulated, which is derived from mental action. So it's just reminding us that there are different types of karma. We've, of course, studied about this, or we heard about this as part of the first part of the Lamrim, the practices that are common of a person of weaker spiritual aspiration. But here in particular, it talks about karma. So it's reminding us of the fact that there's karma, or there are actions that come from the mind. So the karma of intention. So these are, well, the intentions that our mind generates in every moment. And then there's that which arises from these intentions. So these intentions can be neutral. So not much to worry about because their results will be neutral. But then, of course, virtues and non-virtues intentions, which then inspire, or which then induce certain actions of speech and mind, which, depending on the motivation, depending on the intention, are either virtuous or non-virtuous. So just to be aware of that again and again, because I guess we often have the sense, oh, well, that's just a tiny action. It's just a tiny activity that no one knows about except me. So, well, it can't be that bad. But of course, as anything, I mean, in the environment, even in the natural world, any activity, any kind of action gives rise to a reaction. And so therefore that's true for our own actions as well. And those manifest in the form of experiences. Experiences more than anything else. So therefore, to watch our mind, to be aware, of course, of the forces that lead to the karmic actions, which are the afflictions, mixed then with the mental, or giving rise to certain mental actions, certain intentions, and those then inducing actions of the speech, so saying certain things motivated by, well, anger or love and so forth, as well as physical actions. They don't have to. I mean, just sometimes the thoughts will have virtuous or non-virtuous thoughts, and they also lead to certain experiences in the future. But if it's a strong kind of mental action, then it's more likely to induce verbal as well as physical actions, so actions of body and speech. And those are called karma accumulated, which is derived from mental actions, or intended karma, depending on how you translate this terminology. So karma of intention, the intention, and then that which is intended, actions of body and speech that are intended, that are induced by that mental action. And again, to watch out for the afflictions, watch out for karma, and also be aware, and in this context, that is also explained that there are different types of karmic actions, in particular when it comes to virtuous and non-virtuous actions. Neutral actions are not as strong, but virtuous actions can be really powerful, very strong, and non-virtuous can be too, which accounts for the fact that there's something called projecting karma. So a very powerful virtuous or non-virtuous karma can actually be responsible for projecting our rebirth, either in a more positive state, a celestial realm, a human realm, or a more negative state, a negative state in the sense of the amount of suffering, but also of the lack of opportunities, lack of freedom, basically. So to watch out for extremely strong non-virtuous actions, of course, in particular. But if these actions are not that strong, well, then They may be what's called completing karma. So not projecting us into another rebirth in our next life, but basically accounting for our different experiences, maybe in this life, but also in future lives. And again, it's like up to us. It's basically up to us. We're creating our own future, and to be aware of that in each moment. So what do we want to experience? Well, let's create the causes now. So that's something we're reminded of as part of these outlines in the Lam Rim. There's more to it, of course, but one of the times you go through details. But if you're more interested, you can, of course, read on your own. You can read through the commentaries. And most importantly, reflect on these ideas in connection with what we're studying here. Which takes me to the next part, which is not so much a question, but Dalit asked me to summarize my answer, the answer I gave to B in response to her question. So first I thought I'd just do it verbally, but then I decided it's easier to give you this handout. Okay, so it was a very important question, and I'm also glad that Dalit asked me to summarize it, which is a really good idea. By the way, I'm grateful actually to everyone's question, because oftentimes it points out to me which parts I neglected to explain or I didn't explain enough. So it's really helpful to have all these different questions. So please keep them coming. But anyway, so to address B's question, so she asked about this last part about when we analyze arising, why do we analyze that which arises? Okay, so I prepared this little handout. So let me just go through it. So as we all know, one of the main methods of gaining an understanding of the emptiness, and that is, and therefore the ultimate nature of a phenomenon. So we start with certain objects. We can't take all phenomena at the beginning. We start with certain things, certain objects. So one method, the main method, is to search for the inherent existence of the phenomenon. It's that which appears to our mind. So the object of negation, we look for it. Where do we search for that inherent existence, for that concrete and substantial existence that so vividly appears to our mind every time we take something to mind, every time we perceive something? Well, we look for the inherent existence of a particular phenomenon among its parts. Nowhere else to look other than among its parts. So the basis of designation, as it's also called. And this is done by subjecting the phenomenon, its parts, and possibly other related phenomena to ultimate analysis. So the phenomenon itself, of course, then its parts, and possibly something related to that. We engage in what's called ultimate analysis. So in the case of objects such as a car, a table, the eye, the body, and so forth, we search for their inherent existence among their spatial parts, as an example, if they have spatial parts, of course. So, for instance, the engine, steering wheel, etc. So here they have this picture that's in another handout. So, like just taking it apart, where is the car within the car? They can do the same with the table, etc. The eye, I mean, what's part of the eye is, of course, the body. So and so it has spatial parts, and the body itself has as well, of course. Anyway, or the temporal parts. So, for instance, yesterday's car, today's car, tomorrow's car. So here, today's the 28th. So yesterday's, tomorrow's car, and so forth. But of course, to go even subtler, because that's just a coarse analysis. But from moment to moment, the car, that is that which makes the car, that which comprises the car, the subtle particles, for instance, going as subtle as to that level of atoms and molecules, well, they're constantly changing. How can there be anything concrete and substantial about this car the way it appears to us? Something that is within this object that is so solid as it appears to us, as if it was able to define itself, self-sustaining over there. In actuality, it's just made of these really tiny aspects, these tiny particles, which of course are changing all the time. So in that way, reflecting on that helps us to let go of the sense of solidity, the sense of objective existence, and so forth. However, it is not enough to analyze only these objects. So cars, tables, I, and so forth. We must also examine the functions and thus the actions that these phenomena perform. Why? Because we perceive these as existing inherently and generate many different afflictions in relation to them. So think of the 8 worldly dharmas, wanting to be praised, for instance. So that's an activity of praise. It's not, I mean, praise, we look at it maybe as a noun, but it's really, we can use it as a noun, but it's actually this activity of being praised, of being liked, for instance. It consists of moments in time. So there's certain actions or other actions of wanting to be, I don't know, wanting to have something explained to ourselves, wanting to be treated well, etc. So our afflictions, of course, also exist in relation to these actions. Therefore, it's important to analyze actions. In the case of actions such as walking, giving, producing, arising, etc., the search for their inherent existence and therefore their analysis is somewhat different and arguably more difficult than that of other objects. Right? So we say activity, action. I mean, what does that even mean? So in terms of like an object, you can hold on to it. So, I mean, compared to that, it's quite different because although many actions can be observed, yes, we can see them or observe them, or maybe hear them. They are more abstract than, for example, the sense objects we can hold in our hands, smell, and so on. An action has no spatial parts and can only be perceived as an extended continuum made up of different moments in time. So an action always consists of something that occupies time, a certain period, a longer period. For example, in the action of walking, one foot is lifted and propelled forward. The foot then strikes the ground with the heel and rolls through the toe, while the other foot is lifted and propelled forward, and so on. So really walking, what do we call walking? It's like you lift the foot. Okay, where's the lifting the foot? Here's like you lift the foot, you propel it forwards, and so forth. So it's these moments in time, different action, different moments, with each moment being different. Or, well, different anyway. I mean, of course, if it's impermanent, every moment is different anyway, but different in the sense that it's like picture frames, if you like, with each frame showing something different. And so that accounts for this movement here. Okay, so therefore, any action is such a continuum. So based on this here, when we watch this, we label walking. Furthermore, since actions depend on their agent or subject, agent, subject, so that which performs the action, and in the case of certain actions, it's not true for all actions, on their objects. What is the object? That which receives or is affected by the action. Agent and object are also analyzed along with the actions. So as part of this ultimate analysis, what is also analyzed are the agent, that which performs the action, or the object. So typical, for instance, for the action of giving, in order to understand the action of giving, so what is the agent, what is the recipient, what is the object, and understanding that they all lack inherent existence. So we're all familiar with that, like the lack of inherent existence of giving. So for instance, in the entry into the middle way, when it talks about generosity as part of the first chapter, at the very end, it talks about these 3 aspects of the lack of inherent existence of that which gives, of that which is given, and of the action of giving itself. All right, so therefore, here, this analysis of the action is done in connection with the agent and the object. It's part of the analysis. Actions such as giving and producing have a direct object. So giving an object, so a recipient, there's an object that is given. And producing something, for instance, the seed produces the sprout, so the sprout is the object. And they're expressed by transitive verbs. This is true in English as well as in Tibetan, and probably many other languages, while actions such as walking and arising do not have such an object. So walking, There's no object, there's an agent, the person who walks, for instance. Arising, as we've heard, has no object but an agent. They do not have such an object, so it doesn't need to be analyzed, and they're expressed by intransitive verbs. Anyway, having all said all this, so the first chapter of the Fundamental Wisdom begins with the ultimate analysis of the action of arising. How random is that, right? Like arising. I mean, it's like we have difficulty anyway to find a suitable word. It's not that easy. I mean, a suitable term we can use in English. And anyway, it's not a word we usually think about much, or an idea, or well, at least an action we think about much. But why is it described first? Well, this is because the verse of homage in this text, the Fundamental Wisdom, as you probably remember, pays object to dependent arising by describing the 8 attributes of the dependent arising of impermanent phenomena. There's a lot of discussion in terms of dependent arising. There are 8 attributes that are discussed a lot. There traditionally have been a lot of discussion between the different philosophers with regard to those 8. So these are considered to be important for the understanding of dependent arising. And of course, dependent arising, as we all know, assists us in our understanding of emptiness. And so these 8 attributes described in the verse of homage are presented in 4 pairs: ceasing and arising, annihilation and permanence, coming and going, and distinction and identity. So these are these 4 pairs amounting for 8 attributes. Although of these 8, ceasing is mentioned first in the verse of homage, Lama Tsongkhapa explains in his Ocean of Reasoning, in his commentary on the Fundamental Wisdom, that since it is easier to understand the lack of inherent existence of ceasing after understanding the lack of inherent existence of arising, arising is analyzed first. Because to us, first something arises and then it ceases, which is not just true for us. I mean, first there's the arising at the time of the cause, and once it's there, it starts to cease. So it makes perfectly sense. I mentioned that in one of the handouts. I didn't mention then it's from Lama Tsongkhapa, because everything I say is really based on the commentary, so no need to explain it. But yeah, that's really what Lama Tsongkhapa explains. And that's why arising is analyzed first. Okay. As part of the ultimate analysis of arising, the first line of verse 4, an action has no conditions, the first line, examines the agent or subject of arising. That is, it examines, that's to say, it examines that which arises. So the agent or subject, what is it that arises? As I said early on, that's usually how it's done. It doesn't necessarily have to be analyzed in that way. You can also analyze each moment. Where's the arising within each moment? But eventually you want to examine also that without which arising couldn't happen, the agent. So you examine that which arises. Since the arising of an impermanent phenomenon, such as a sprout, occurs at a time of the causes and conditions of the sprout, and since this arising, like all other phenomena, appears to our mind to exist inherently, intrinsically, the following analysis is presented. So where does the arising exist? At the time when the sprout actually doesn't exist yet. Moreover, it appears to exist inherently. To our mind, we may not be aware of it, but let's face it, everything we take to mind, it appears to exist in and of itself, objectively, and so forth. So the following analysis is therefore presented for our own sake. Everything that exists has either arisen or not arisen. We can all agree on that. There's no third possibility. It logically makes sense. Everything that exists is either a table or not, right? Most phenomena are not tables, but therefore it's still true. I mean, either it's a table or it's not a table. So most phenomena are not tables, but still there's some phenomena that are tables, and there's no third possibility. The same is true for everything that exists has either arisen or not arisen. Okay. We've heard there's some phenomena that haven't arisen, because here arisen means to have arisen independence of causes and conditions. And of course, there are permanent phenomena that have not arisen. Okay. mentioned that in on one of the footnotes earlier. So here arisen, strictly speaking, in this context, refers to impermanent phenomena. So there are permanent phenomena that, of course, have not arisen. And anything that doesn't exist also hasn't arisen. But anyway, we're just talking about that which does exist. Okay, either arisen or not arisen. No third possibility. So having established that, therefore, since that which arises, the sprout, does it exist or not? We would say, yes, of course it exists. Sprout exists. So it has necessarily either arisen or not arisen. It can only be one of the two. If it's A, if it had arisen, we're talking about here at the time of the cause, there would be no point in it arising again. Why would it be arising then? Because it has already arisen and therefore already exists. If it had not arisen, it could not be a sprout, because a sprout is an impermanent phenomenon and must have arisen in dependence on its causes and conditions. So, how can the sprout exist? Everything that exists, either arisen or not arisen, but none of these two make sense. All right. So, but here we're saying if arising existed inherently, that is, existed objectively and from its own side, the way it appears to us, or as it appears to our mind, that which arises, the sprout, would have to exist together with it. If there was this concrete arising, then that which arises has to be together with it. I mean, there's no way without it, because just arising doesn't make sense. It is not merely labeled according to our mind, according to the way it appears to us, and of course, according to some philosophers. So if it existed inherent, or if it existed the way it appears to our mind, or as it appears to our mind, the sprout, that which arises, would have to exist together with it. But such a sprout cannot be found because it has neither arisen or not arisen, nor not arisen. It has neither arisen nor not arisen. Now, this is the analysis that is quite similar to the analysis, and I mentioned that. I didn't add this here because I felt it was getting too long and there wasn't much time. But it's similar to the analysis of the eye. Similar, only similar. Of course, there's certain differences, but if the eye existed, it would either have to be one with the aggregates or separate, totally separate from it. Either be exactly the same or totally separate from it. There's no other possibility. This is not true for the conventionally existent eye, because that is merely labeled. It doesn't have to be exactly one or totally separate, because it's merely labeled. We'll speak more about this later on. Here, it's slightly different. It's saying if the arising is merely labeled, then in answer to this question, has the sprout arisen or not, we say, well, the sprout has arisen. It's an arisen phenomenon, but not at that time. It doesn't have to exist together with arising. It's merely labeled. We say the sprout arises, but they don't have to exist together because there's no inherent arising. It's merely labeled. It's merely labeled on the basis of this process of the seed changing to then in the future give rise to that which we call the sprout. So we label arising. And since that which is arising, we label as the sprout, so the conventional sprout, we also label sprout as arising. So it doesn't have to exist with the arising. It doesn't have to exist at the same time. And it's still correct conventionally to say that although at the time of its causes, there's no sprout, the sprout is arising, right? It's like saying, I planted an apple tree in my garden, although there's no apple tree yet, right? Or the apple tree is slowly growing. Where's the apple tree? Oh, it's not there yet. Okay, that's merely labeled. But if there was an inherent arising, an inherent growing, then the tree would have to be there. Okay, so that's what's presented here. Dalit, does that make sense, or does that summarize that? Okay, great.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, so if anyone has further questions, you are welcome to send it to Dalit. Okay, so let me now go into the text because we're right there. That's exactly the part that I just read in the summary. I mean, I summarized that last bit, but what I need you to do, or what I want you to understand is that, yes, we're not familiar with analyzing objects such as actions. To a certain degree, maybe yes. Oh yeah, the giver, the given, and the giving don't exist inherently. We hear it again and again. But how much time do we really spend on examining that? Well, here we've got the opportunity with the fundamental wisdom, because Nagarjuna does a lot of that. I mean, there's going to be one of the chapters going and coming. What is going and coming? Again, labeled on the basis of what? It's tiresome. It's not as easy as just sitting in front of a table, or maybe having a table you can take apart, or having a car and taking it apart and go, oops, it's not there. But of course, there's more to it. I mean, there are certain functions a car performs, there are actions it performs, and we need to look at them as well. Okay. All right. Yes. So this is not easy. It's difficult. I mean, going through these reasonings is so difficult. I mean, we've just in verse 4 and it's already 5, and it's so difficult. But I think remaining in samsara is more difficult. So I think we're okay. All right. So anyway, let's look at this part here now. Oh no, this is the same. It's still the extra handout. Wait. First chapter. Oh, here we are. All right. So verse 4. Where do we, what? Oh no, this is too much. Is it verse 4 or verse 5? Ooh, did I say 4 here? I keep making mistakes. No, 5. Oh, there's 4. Yep. Which reminds me, so thank you to Jimmy. He noticed this mistake that I hadn't changed yet, so he pointed it out. This was previously observed, but I made a mistake. So this should be dominant, uncommon dominant condition. So I changed that. So anyone else who finds mistakes, please let me know. Okay, so with verse 4, we've got this weird verse where it seems to be very contradictory. An action has no conditions. There's no action that is without conditions. That which lacks action is no condition, nor do conditions have action. So that which lacks action is no condition, nor do conditions have actions. So it seems very contradictory, but it needs to be explained. Okay, so again, to have a condition, to have actions, it's just saying that a condition is of one nature, or a cause for that matter is of one nature. It's inseparably linked with the arising of its result. And so these two are linked, the arising of the result and that cause or that condition. Nagarjuna speaks mainly of conditions, but cause and condition in this context are, of course, equivalent or synonymous. Okay, anyway, so in the first line it says an action has no condition, which really means an inherent action has no condition. So an inherent action is not inseparably linked to conditions, because it's not of one nature with them and it does not depend on them. This is because an inherent action such as arising doesn't exist. Because if it existed, we would be able to find it into relation to that which arises. So in this case, the example is not a seed and sprout, but the 3 conditions which give rise to an I consciousness. Okay. I went through this last time, but just to remind you. Anyway, so here we hear again, anything that exists. So if that which arises is the I consciousness, it arises at the time of its causes, either it has been generated or it has not yet been generated. Those are the 2 possibilities. We've heard this before. In the first case, if it has already arisen, why would it arise again? In the second case, well, an I consciousness that has not arisen, no, an I consciousness that has not arisen cannot be an I consciousness. So an I consciousness that is, it does not make sense, nor does it make sense to say that arising produces an I consciousness that has not arisen, because such a consciousness doesn't exist. There is no consciousness that has not arisen. Consciousness is impermanent. It has therefore necessarily arisen, independent on its causes and conditions. If inherent arising, I think this is where we got to, if inherent arising could produce an I consciousness that had not arisen, so if inherent arising, if there were inherent arising that could produce an I consciousness that had not arisen, it could also produce other non-existences, such as the horns of a rabbit or the hair of a tortoise. Okay, the hair of a tortoise. You haven't heard that as often as you've heard the horns of a rabbit, I guess, but it's also one of the classic examples, the hair of a tortoise. Yeah, well, they're hairless, so a tortoise, it's a non-existent, the hair of a tortoise. Okay. So if inherent existence, therefore, if inherent arising, if that could really give rise to an I consciousness that had not arisen, so if it were to arise to a non-existent consciousness, in other words, that wouldn't make sense. Okay, so I hope it's clear. It's talking about the fact that if inherent arising existed, then at the same time, that which arises would have to exist together with it. And if it had already arisen, it wouldn't have to arise. And if it didn't exist, then the arising, well, first of all, there wouldn't be anything that is arising, but besides that, it would give rise to something that is impossible. Finally, okay, goes on, since everything, and this of course is Lama Tsongkhapa saying this, I just summarized it, since everything that exists has either arisen or not arisen, there's nothing that is currently arising that is not one of the two. Do you agree? Something that is, so either it has arisen, it has not yet arisen, or it is currently arising. But even in the case of these three, they are subsumed under, that is, they pertain to one of the two. Even that which is currently arising is either it has arisen or it's not arisen. In fact, actually, which right now is currently arising has not yet arisen. How can it have arisen? We're talking here conventional, right? It's true to say it hasn't arisen yet. Therefore, thus, inherent arising cannot be found in relation to what has arisen, what has not arisen, or what is in the process of arising, right? Because this analysis we did on the basis of the assumption that arising exists inherently. So, but we don't find anything that has not arisen, that is in the process of arising, or that has arisen. And since it cannot be found to give rise to anything in the three times, we can conclude that inherent arising doesn't exist and therefore does not depend on conditions. Okay, so this is the logic of why an inherent action has no conditions. Okay, that's the first line. The second line goes on to say, and again, Lama Tsongkhapa explains it in this way, and not just Lama Tsongkhapa's, other commentaries as well, but Lama Tsongkhapa's explanation is most extensive. But if one thinks that an action such as arising has no conditions, Nagarjuna explains that there's no action without conditions. Here it's going into conventional, because there's no conventionally existent arising of a result that is not dependent on the conditions that produce the result, right? So again, of course, there's no action here. No action means arising. It refers to arising. You can't have arising. You can't have the arising of, let's say, a sprout without the conditions or the causes that are of one nature with it. Okay, let me just go back to this little chart here. Taking the immediately preceding condition, or the uncommon dominant condition, or the observed condition. They're all of one nature with the arising of their result. So this is called an observed condition because, on one hand, it produces the I consciousness perceiving the tree, so that producing is of one nature with it, but also at the same time, the arising of the I consciousness perceiving a tree, that's also of one nature. Those are one entity, okay? So they're inseparably linked, in other words. If one is missing, you don't have the other. All right. Okay, so therefore, a conventionally existent, there's no conventionally existent or arising of a result that doesn't have this condition, that is not inseparably linked to this condition on the action, the cause that produces the result. So the three conditions that facilitate a rising of an I consciousness did not exist. The three conditions that facilitate a rising of an I consciousness did not exist. There would be no rising of the I consciousness. That is, the I consciousness would not arise or come into existence. Actually makes sense, right? All right, there's footnotes. We don't need to read through it. If there were a rising of the I consciousness without such causes and conditions, okay, so if without, let's take the seed. At the time of the seed, you have the arising of the sprout. But if you had the arising of the sprout without the seed, it would follow. Or if you had the arising of the I consciousness without the three conditions, it would follow that the I consciousness and all other impermanent phenomena could arise without being inseparably linked with causes and conditions. This would mean that anything could arise from anything, and all efforts to bring about a particular result would be in vain. Okay, anything could arise. So, for instance, what is a cause to generating bodhicitta? It's becoming familiar with that, meditating, becoming familiar. First of all, as we go through it, every time we generate the motivation, at least through the meditation on affectionate love, great compassion, and the special altruistic attitude. So when we meditate on those, what is arising? Bodhicitta is arising. Okay. It may take a long time until it has finally arisen, because we've been meditating for quite a while, but actually it is arising. At that time, when we're meditating, according to this explanation, being a cause for bodhicitta, bodhicitta is arising. But if that meditation, as an example of causes and conditions for bodhicitta, weren't there, and you still have bodhicitta arising, you wouldn't have to meditate. It wouldn't be needed, right? So this meditation on great compassion and so forth, they're inseparably linked with the arising. So they produce bodhicitta. They're inseparably linked to the producing of bodhicitta and the arising of bodhicitta. But of course, if you didn't need these causes and conditions, or these causes or conditions, if you didn't need those, then they could just arise without any causes and conditions. Why would you make an effort? One day bodhicitta would be there. Wouldn't it be nice if it just did that on its own? But of course, that doesn't happen. Okay, so that's the second line. On the other hand, one might think that since the arising of a result doesn't exist, okay, so this is a little bit, the third line, the way Lama Tsongkhapa explains it, is a little bit more complicated. But it perfectly makes sense. On the other hand, one might think that since the arising of a result doesn't exist, so the person goes, okay, there's no rising. Previously inherent arising has been negated, so there's no rising. There's no inherent arising. There's only the action of producing. Someone may think, okay, there's no arising, that doesn't exist inherently, but there's real producing. And the thing with that is, the other day I talked to Gila, and she gave me this example. We talked about like how difficult it is to understand what is arising in the first place, like about objects and so forth. Is how much easier it is to understand a table, etc. And she gave the example of a potter. So producing, it's actually much more obvious to us that someone produces something. So visualize this potter. Actually, I have a picture of a potter somewhere. So a potter forming a vase. So we can watch that producing. You could say we can also see the vase arising to a certain degree. I mean, it's just a lump of clay. There's no vase yet, but we could say, okay, so the vase is arising, but the producing is probably in the forefront. Yeah, so usually we think much more of it being produced than it arising. That's much less of a, but if it has arisen at some point, the arising must precede it. And since once it's there, it has arisen, well, the arising can only take place at the time of its cause. Makes sense, doesn't it? Anyway, but let's assume someone thinks that there is no arising. Okay, arising has been negated. There's no inherent arising. There's only producing. It should be inherent, but in the text, it's not described. So let's just say, okay, there's only the action of producing implied by that. There's only inherent in producing. So someone may think, okay, there's no inherent arising, there's only producing. The result which is performed by there's only the action of producing the result which is performed by the conditions. Okay, no arising, only producing. In other words, one might assume that there are only conditions that produce a result, such as an I consciousness, but there's no arising of the I consciousness since arising has previously been negated. In response to this, Nagarjuna explains, that which lacks action is not a condition. This means that if the action of arising doesn't exist, that which is responsible for that non-existent action doesn't exist either, and thus is not a condition. Makes sense, right? They're inseparably linked. But here the words lacks action do not refer to conventionally existent actions, but to intrinsically existent actions. So here he's saying is that which lacks inherent action is not a condition. So he's interpreting it this way. Implied is something else as well, but let's look at it this way. It's a little bit more complicated because on first seeing this, we may think, oh, he's talking about conventionally existent, but Namasankapa explains it this way. So if that which lacks inherent action is not a condition. All right, that's what he's saying. Dhammasakapa says, Nagarjuna argues that since there's no inherently existent action of arising, there can be no conditions on which such an action depends. Makes sense, right? If there's no inherent, there cannot be any condition. For if something doesn't exist, how can there be conditions that are responsible for its existence? Okay, I mean, ordinarily we say yes, you can only have the arising of, I mean, conventionally we said you can only have the action if there is the condition. You can only have the condition. I mean, you can only have the arising if there's the condition, and you can only have the condition if there's the arising. But if the arising existed inherently, there couldn't be any action that depends on it. For if something doesn't exist, how can there be conditions that are responsible for its existence? So conventionally, that's the case. The conditions are, or the causes are responsible for the existence of the arising of the result. But in the case of an inherent arising, that's of course not true. And if conditions such as the immediately preceding condition, etc., didn't facilitate the arising of their result, such as I consciousness, how could there be conditions? If there were conditions, without being responsible for the arising of their result, it would follow that anything could be a condition of anything. Does that logic make sense? Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah, this is just to make our mind more flexible. I mean, it's like I said that in one class before. I mean, some of our texts, it's like instead of saying A is B, they say A is C, and because if it's C is necessarily E, and whatever's E must be F, and so therefore A. You know, it's like it goes around just to keep attentive, to stay attentive. but to try and follow the logic and also understand how everything is connected. And it's not easy, but that's why we do it. It shouldn't be easy because, well, anything to train our mind needs to be complicated. Okay, so to know, therefore, the word. So again, this logic is, the logic is if there were inherent action, if there were inherent arising, if there were inherently existent arising, you wouldn't need a condition, right? You don't need conditions that are of one nature with that inherently existent arising. But if you insist that although there's an inherently existent arising, if you still have conditions, well, these conditions wouldn't be responsible for that arising because the arising wouldn't depend on them. So if you had conditions without being, if you had causes that are not responsible for the arising of their result, then anything could be a condition of anything, right? Because it wouldn't be responsible. So for instance, a sand grain could be called the condition of a sprout, because if a condition doesn't have to be responsible for the arising of the sprout, then you could say anything is the condition, is the cause of a sprout. Okay. So implied by that is, therefore, a condition is only a condition, it's only a cause or a condition if it does not lack the action of arising. That is, if it is of one nature with and responsible for the conventional existent action of arising of its result. That is implied by this. So that which lacks action is not a condition, can be read in the way just done. That which lacks inherent action is not a condition, but implied by that is that that which lacks a conventional action is not a condition either. Okay, that is implied by this. It's implied, and you find out in the next verse from what Tsongkhapa explains, becomes obvious that this is implied. Therefore, a condition is only a condition if it does not lack the action of arising. That if it is of one nature with and responsible for the conventionally existing action of arising of its result. Only then is it a condition. Okay, that's line number 3. Suppose one thought that only conditions that have arising, that is to say, that are responsible for the arising of their result, produce or give rise to that result. If that someone were to think that, but here they're again thinking of inherent. Nagarjuna inherently arising. So that's implied by that, because Nagarjuna explains that conditions have no action because conditions have no inherently existent action. That is, they're not responsible for the inherently existent action of arising. All right. This seems like, why is he saying that? He said it all before. No, but it's a slightly different way, which maybe becomes obvious by the summary here. In short, the first 2 lines of verse 4 indicate that the action of arising of a result neither has conditions nor is without them, while the last 2 lines indicate that conditions neither lack the action of arising nor have the action of arising. So you see what happens here? The first 2 lines, the arising, looking at the arising that is of one nature with the conditions, the arising of a result, neither has conditions nor is without them. Okay. So it's not that difficult, but the wording's a little bit. Okay, so let's take the immediately preceding condition. The arising of its result neither has conditions, doesn't have inherent conditions, nor does it lack conventional condition. So in other words, the arising of that I consciousness is inseparably linked, not with an inherent condition, but with an conventional condition. Or did I get it wrong right now? I'm getting confused. I think I got that wrong. Let me just go back. in short, the first two lines, that the action of arising neither has conditions. Oh, yes, that's right. So it has the action of arising of a result neither has conditions. So an inherent action does not have conditions, but a conventional action of arising is not without them. Okay, so the action of arising here needs to be specified. Okay. While the last two lines indicate that conditions neither lack the action of arising nor have the action of arising. So in the first case, the action of arising is that which either has or has not conditions. And in the last two lines is the conditions that either lacks or does not lack the action of arising. Yeah. This is really complicated. I mean, it sounds more complicated than it actually is. And maybe it helps this summary, this last summary, because here it's really like saying it's like two opposites, that something is these two opposites, which of course is impossible. But more specifically, what these four lines mean, well, the first two lines indicate that an inherently existing arising of a result does not depend on conditions. That's really what it's saying. While a conventionally existing arising does. Second line. Okay. The last two lines indicate that if there's no inherently existing arising of a result, there can be no conditions on which such an action depends. But a condition is a condition only if it does not lack a conventionally existing arising. Line 3. And number 4, also, conditions do not have an inherently existing arising, since they cannot facilitate such an action. Does that make sense? So, of course, the first and the last one are similar. However, the first one is looking at it from the point of view of the inherent arising. What is its relation to the condition? The last one is looking at the conditions and its relation to the inherent arising. So it's just looking at it from a different perspective. All right.
I wonder
Mm-hmm.
that the grammarian, do they look for conditions for their inherent arising?
I don't know. I haven't met any grammarian. I mean, well, the problem is I don't know. I don't know because I don't know much about the
The
grammarians.
logic here is very complicated, but yet at the same time, at the heart of it is a basic contradiction. To say something is inherently existing or arising, while also saying that it depends on condition. Because
B, you're so right.
So,
our whole life is full of contradictions, isn't it, B?
So I'm just wondering if this is Nagarjuna imposing his own logic on somebody else and then trying to debunk it. Or did those people who assert inherent something and then at the same time look for condition?
Well, the thing is, first of all, I mean, when I said, well, anyway, forget about our own lives. But in terms of philosophers, I mean, just check out the lower schools. Here, the grammarians. I don't know much about the grammarians. I looked them up and I couldn't really find much about them. But even just considering the lower schools, the lower Buddhist schools, such as the Vaibhashika and so forth, I mean, they all assert that they're causes and conditions. And their assumption is that because these causes and conditions exist inherently, there are causes and conditions. They couldn't be causes and conditions without existing inherently, right? So there's actually a great contradiction from a Prasangika school point of view, which makes it even more difficult to refute their assertions. Their assertion is because something is a condition, therefore it must exist inherently. Prasangika or Nagarjuna's assertion is because it lacks inherent existence, it can be a condition. So they're the total opposites. And it's extremely difficult. And like, as I said before, the grammarians, first of all, are they probably never read what Nagarjuna said, or if any of them, very few of them. But it's not so much about the Gurumarians here. It's about anyone asserting inherent existence. Anyone in asserting inherent existence, to understand that to our mind, I mean, we may not rationally assert this, but our mind, in each moment when inherent existence of arising and of conditions and so forth appears to it, it's in contradiction with reality, right? So on one hand, we assert that there are conditions. Our mind asserts that, but to that mind, these conditions appear inherently. So there's already a contradiction just from the point of view of what appears and what we perceive, right? And here we're not just talking about appearances. Given a certain situation, our mind actively perceives an inherent arising, an inherent producing, an inherent this, an inherent that. And still we believe things change. I mean, about the eye changes, but it exists inherently. Total contradiction. Right, B? Does that make sense? Yeah. So what we're doing, I mean, just going through this logic here, the whole point of it is it's not just understanding this and going great and being able to explain it, but of course to then meditate on it, which I want to do, of course, today. I'm checking the time to make sure we'll have enough time, because here Nagarjuna is giving us the opportunity to very slowly and thoroughly look at these two concepts of the conditions or the causes of them facilitating arising, and now focusing on the arising itself, which seems to our mind, I mean, of course, everything else appears as well, but the arising in particular appears to exist inherently. So here, does it work in terms of its existence, and in particular in relation to the conditions that they're of one nature with, right? So it gives us the opportunity to consider that. And it's not going to be meditating on that. It's not like you rise from that and you go, oh, I got it, I understand emptiness. No, it's just a tiny puzzle piece in the puzzle, in that huge puzzle of emptiness, right? And it's just, unfortunately, so extremely difficult to realize emptiness that we need these tiny little steps, and they're all important, but they're not going to drastically change everything. Okay. Anyway, I hope that answered your question, B. And if there are any other question, we have maybe time for one more before we start to meditate. Any question? You just raise your hand or just start talking if you want. Is the logic completely clear?
Yes, it is clear.
It's clear? Okay.
Yes,
great.
easy.
Snehi, what about it? You
know,
look
Geshe, I'm
skeptical.
so sorry. I've missed classes. So for me, it like is jumping, in and it is confusing, but I'm sure if I read it again. But what came to my mind was, what the question B was asking. And it feels like all of this is so problematic because, we are raised in the scientific worldview that even if, you talk about string theory or energy or particles, there's something there which is subject to change and conditions, and we get things out of it. So the idea that even when you dig through the string and the energy and the quantum particles or whatever, that at some point there is nothing objective. That the cause and conditions themselves are not objective.
Yes, it's difficult. I mean, how do you account for differences? How do you account for something as complicated as string theory? I don't even know what that means really, but never mind. In all these complicated, there's incredible variations. Nothing exists inherently, right? I mean, for the lower schools, that is a reason to say that everything must exist inherently. Otherwise, you couldn't have the differences. For Nagarjuna, it's saying can only exist because it lacks. And that's what's so hard. Yeah. We're up to something really powerful, and that's our own mind that has a sense it's the opposite. And the only way to go about it is to try and sneak past this holding on to it through reflection on this. So let's try and meditate on it. Okay. Okay, great. Today I'm actually too early. That's quite rare. Anyway, okay. Now, as usual, we start with the breathing, but let me just make sure I've got everything right here, what I need for the meditation, because I want to take you through these 4 aspects. Okay, so let's start by, of course, focusing on the breath for some time, doing some mindfulness meditation of the breath to let go of any confusion, any disruptive thoughts, and be totally in the present. So then take a moment to allow for your sense of arising to appear to your mind. Whatever is your understanding of the arising of a sprout, for instance, allow for it to appear to your mind. The coming into existence of a sprout. So, Nagarjuna says an action has no conditions. In other words, an inherent arising of the sprout has no conditions. The way arising appears to our mind as existing in and of itself cannot have conditions that it's separately linked to. Because if it were to exist, If arising were possible to exist inherently, then that which arises, the sprout, will be as concrete and findable as the arising. And since that which arises, the sprout, can only be one of the two. It has arisen or it has not arisen. Let's check these two possibilities. At the time of the seed, if that which arises, the sprout, had already arisen, we wouldn't need its arising. There wouldn't be any point for its cause. Because it's already there. But if at the time of the seed, the sprout had not arisen, then the sprout would be not existent. For a sprout is impermanent and has therefore arisen in dependence on causes and conditions. And so at the time of the seed, the rising of something totally non-existent, like the hair of a tortoise. The hair of a tortoise would take place. Therefore, inherent arising doesn't make sense. Because nothing can be found that inherently arises. Does that mean that arising has no condition or lacks a condition? Well, Nagarjuna says there is no action, that is no arising without conditions. Because there is no conventionally or merely labeled arising of a result. That is not inseparably linked to certain conditions, causes. And then Nagarjuna explains that which lacks arising is not a condition. Saying that if arising existed the way it appears to our mind, how could it be linked to a condition? How could it be dependent on a condition? There wouldn't be any causes and conditions facilitating that arising. And if hypothetically there were causes, there were conditions, without being responsible for the arising of their results, well, then anything could be a condition of anything. Virtuous karma could be a cause of suffering, since it wouldn't be responsible for the arising of that suffering. So therefore, for an actual condition, an actual cause, to be a cause, it cannot lack. It cannot be without. conventionally, that is merely labeled arising of its result. Then Nagarjuna explains in the fourth line that conditions have no rising. Focusing on a conventional, a proper condition. Although it facilitates conventional arising, it does not possibly facilitate an inherent arising of a result. So to conclude our contemplation, let's focus on whatever insight you've gained. And single pointedly focus on that for a few moments to allow for it to sink deeper. Sink deeper into your mind. And then let's dedicate all the positive potential we've accumulated by listening, contemplating, and meditating on the fundamental wisdom. By thinking, may this, of course, become one of the causes for us to realize emptiness, experience it, realize it directly in order for us to be able to remove with that direct realization of emptiness all the obscurations to liberation and enlightenment, so that based on our deep care for sentient beings, become fully enlightened and be of the greatest benefit to each and every sentient being. And may, in the meantime, may whatever positive potential we've accumulated become a cause for our great masters who teach us through their example and through their words. Our great masters like His Holiness the Dalai Lama have an extremely long and healthy life, so that we never be separated from them. And of course, may our positive potential as well, but likewise affect the people around us, even right here and right now. Especially those we're linked to, we're connected to. May I help Geshe Punsok and Tashi Lubin, Tabi Lubin to get better really, really soon. And everyone else who's suffering mentally, physically, and so forth to find quick relief. And may it affect many sentient beings to generate the aspiration, the wish to transform their own mind in a positive way. Find more love, compassion, and wisdom. So with this in mind, let's dedicate together by reciting the prayers. Through the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chinrizik, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. Okay, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
have a great week. Don't forget your meditation and your reflection, and I see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you, Geshe.
bye.
you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dali.
Thank you, Dalit.